right. Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome again to our SPU Fireside Chat on your team. In this discussion, my co-facilitator Mac and I have gathered a group of SPU professors and alumni from around the city of Seattle. So hopefully some familiar faces for everyone, or most people who will be viewing. And we've really just been interested about the idea of resiliency, both from a perspective, which we talked about in the session we filmed recently, as well as an organizational perspective, which we'll be discussing here today. In either of these sessions, our group will be sharing true stories from their experiences of a time where resiliency was needed and what practices and strategies they use to foster that resiliency within themselves, with the hope that for anybody who's watching and through telling these stories, we can share with you tips that you can then adopt for your own use during a moment of crisis or positive challenges, whether that be today during the virus or next week or a year from now in another situation that we can't possibly anticipate at this moment. So with that, we're just going to jump straight into it, and I am going to hand it over to our co-facilitator, Mac, for introductions.
Awesome. Thanks, Cody. Yeah, we'll just go ahead and start with introducing our lovely panelists that have been a part of this conversation. So Emily, if you want to start.
I'm Emily Pelosi. I'm a research scientist at Amazon, and I work in global talent management, where I primarily focus on measurement, working with the leaders and program managers in our organization to make sure that we're driving the right impact for Amazon.
And Kira.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kira Wenzel, and I work for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and I'm an HR partner there. So I partner with our clients and divisions within the organization to focus on performance conversations, talent reviews, compensation discussions, recruiting needs, all of the items that help us get our work done and drive our talent forward.
Thanks, Kira. And Paul?
Paul Yost. I am associate professor here in the IO Psychology program at Seattle Pacific. I'll add one other. I'm half-time right now, senior director of strategic initiatives, working with the president of SPU, thinking about what's the future of higher education.
Awesome. And Jake?
Awesome. Hi, I'm Jake. I am a learning designer and facilitator for the Google School for Leaders, so I work at Google. And I'm actually the one that's an outsider. I'm based in Mountain View, California, so down in the Bay. But I call Seattle home still. And I am focused on supporting leaders both from a programmatic and non-programmatic standpoint across the globe and across all functions of Google as we help them scale and think differently about the world of work, as it is always and continuously evolving and changing.
And my lovely co-mediator, Cody.
Thank you, Mac. I'm Cody Ann. I am a doctoral candidate at SPU, and I also am a research scientist at the University of Washington for the Center for Leadership and Strategic Thinking, focusing on leadership development.
Great. And I'm Mackenzie Allison, and I also go by Mac, and I'm a doctoral candidate at SPU, as well as an analyst intern at Avanade right now. So we'll go ahead and start with an icebreaker. And recently, as you've heard, if you watched our previous little video on personal resilience, we've written a chapter recently, Paul, Cody, and I. And one of the strategies that came up for both at an organizational level and individual level is support. So for our icebreaker, we're going to go ahead and just go with, who is your go-to point of support when you're not feeling resilient?
It's a great question. And I've been thinking about that. And it's actually, well, especially in this COVID-19 era, my Thursday evenings are filled with my core group of friends that are from Seattle and from the SPU IO program. So we're all in different organizations, but for me, they're my squad. They're the folks that I think get the world of work, and they get me as well as a human. And so I think for me, in those times where maybe my self-efficacy isn't as high, or I am charting new territory, or there's just a lot of unknowns, they're kind of the go-to text message or FaceTime that's like, what am I doing? How do I do this? Am I losing my mind? Or the narrative that's like, am I qualified to do this? Am I capable of doing this? And their reiteration and support for who I am just as a human being, but also as a practitioner, is invaluable. So that's my go-to.
Awesome. Thanks, Jake.
I'd have to say something similar. I probably should say my husband, but instead, I'm gonna say my two best friends from college. We actually haven't lived in the same state since we graduated from college, and we've been in different continents and different states ever since. And so we're used to doing everything by text, video chat, and calling. And so this situation hasn't really changed much for us, other than probably frequency and just knowing that there's folks who I have in my corner that will respond. And we always joke, because there's three of us, if one's busy, you'll generally get a response from the other. So it's a good mechanism of support. If I were to recommend, pick two people, just in case someone's in a different time zone and can't respond.
Awesome. Emily, do you want to go next?
Sure. So I have two cute little grandparents that live in Daytona Beach, Florida. And before this whole COVID event, we would probably talk like once every 2 or 3 months, but for like 3 hours, and just catch up on everything, talk about life. Of course, you have a lot to talk about when you don't talk for 3 months. That's just kind of how my family tends to be. Like, we don't talk for a long time, and then it's just like a full-on event. But since, you know, things have been happening with the pandemic, I've been talking to them more and more. So it's now become a weekly thing where I call them. We're all drinking coffee. They are drinking coffee, staring at the beach, which I'm a little bit jealous of. But it's just really nice to, you know, be able to talk to someone on the other side of the country that knows you really well. And they, of course, like, never knew about IO psychology, or you know, when they were working, like, jobs like mine didn't even exist, but they're so interested in what it is that I do. And so it's just great to talk to someone who asks you good questions and wants to know more about what you do. So
Yeah, I think we all in Seattle wish we were in Daytona right now.
yeah.
It was kind of awkward probably when you had them sign the NDA before you told them what you did.
Well, they don't know that I work at Amazon, but
That works.
I told them I'd have to kill them, but
Great. So my go-to person, I decided it's not a person, it's coffee. So just sitting with a warm cup of coffee. And I forgot to tell you, Cody, I brought my special mug along. This is the sorting hat.
Oh.
Mug. And when you put hot coffee in it, you figure out which house you're in.
That's cool.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Which house are you in?
Slithering.
Don't be so excited.
Well, I've taken a bunch of quizzes, and no matter what I answer, I come out slithering.
Cody, do you have a go-to point of support?
Yeah, so I, since I was the one to create this question, I made sure to say point of support rather than person of support, because it's my dog. It's also some of my IO friends, which I would need to make sure to point out, because I know they'll be watching this and we'll be like, really, you picked your dog again? So they're great, but it's my dog. And I think in the previous video, we talked about our go-to behavior when we're not feeling resilient. And spoiler alert, mine was stress napping. So my dog is a very good napper as well. So it kind of goes hand in hand.
Nice. Yeah, I'm lame. Mine is definitely family. My parents, especially right now, will pick up anytime, and my brother and I definitely are texting throughout the day about usually nothing, but sometimes that's what is good to just, talk about normal things with people right now. So, yeah. And I think now we'll move on to the bulk of our conversation about organizational resilience. And for this, we'll have Jake and Emily kind of tackling this question of what positive or negative event in the workplace has required resilience, and what strategies did you and your organization draw on to navigate through the event?
I'll go first. Why not? Emily, I'll let you go next.
Sounds good.
No, it's a great question because I think it's something that pertains to everything that we stand for and do in the IO space. The example that I would say I'm going to use first and foremost isn't my current organization, but it was my previous organization. So, and it'll be comparing both an entrepreneurial, like startup kind of organization with an organization that's more well-grounded, and what resilience looks like in both of those, and some of the similar themes or threads that tie to both organizations. So for me, my last organization I worked at was a small little startup when I first started several years ago that was focused on electric vehicles. There was less than 2,000 of us, and we were basically trying to build out this philosophy or thought of what electric cars could do for the industry, for the environment, for climate, etc. That organization is Tesla Motors, or Tesla Incorporated, as it is today. But with Tesla, I think the larger part of the experience was it was a month-to-month, quarter-to-quarter experience, partly because you never knew if there were going to be funds for the next quarter, or if you were going to have a job, first and foremost. But part of that is the industry itself. It was tech, but automotive is that there hasn't been a successful automotive company in like 100 years. And so actually getting into the industry in and of itself is tough. And so part of the things I would say that stood out from a resilience perspective of the organization is that there was hope in something bigger. So it didn't matter what the headline was or what a naysayer might have put out there against the organization, is that when I started, it was an organization full of people that believed in something bigger than just a vehicle. They believed in something that was bigger and better for the world. And so that was something that I think was something that we grounded in, was hope. Optimism was another part of what we were focusing on. And then every quarter, as you moved from quarter to quarter and the finances came out, and it would be like, you still aren't profitable, you still aren't profitable. But we would have more and more successes, and that success drove us to continue working harder and harder. And the beauty of the experience from my perspective was that it didn't matter your level in the organization, it didn't matter your job title, we were all in it together, purely because of the mission, vision, and what we believed was possible. When I left Tesla, I left from a 2,000-ish person company to a 46,000. So part of that was just the ability to adapt and change to an unknown environment, to a reality that we didn't know what would exist or how it exists. And now if you look at the headlines today, it's Ford is entering into the electric vehicles. You've got GM entering into it. Volkswagen's trying to figure it out. You've got startups, Rivian, et cetera. Like all of a sudden it's a movement. And I think a lot of folks are focused on the vehicle portion of it, where Tesla was so much more than just a vehicle. It was a lifestyle. It was a way of being. And I think that was something that, like I said, it latched into the optimism of what was possible for the future. Now, fast forward, I now work at a company that's been around for a long time, Google, and 20 plus years, and Google is still in the entrepreneurial space, but you have habits that form. There are things that you've done because that's just the way that you've done it. And so some of the things that I think I've learned from my experience entering into the Tesla sphere and then coming into the Google is, how do you continue ideating, innovating, creating? And the resilience comes in is in challenging and battling to some extent ways of being, bringing lightheartedness, being optimistic of what can be still, even in a behemoth of a company, and really thinking about how you shift your company I think when you get larger and larger, how you shift your company to every reorg that happens, to every expanding vision, to every new function that lines up. So where Tesla was focused on one product, Google has so many products. And so how do you continue pivoting into a reality that keeps Google a competitor, keeps it a leader in the field, in the industry, and recognizing that we're in several industries. So how do you continue staying true to what your core value is, and to drive that truth into every function of your organization, which is more challenging. And so I think that's a hard part for my organization across the board, is thinking about how we continue to scale and change in a way that we're still googly. We're still this organization that values humans, values people, and we can still be competitive in the market. And that's something I love, and I'm excited for our growing and changing organization to continue being around for the next 20 years. I don't know if that gets at it, but I think that's part of, I guess, some of the strategies I would say is focusing in on optimism, focusing in on learning from your past experiences, reflecting on what's worked, what hasn't, adapting to change. Like, change is inevitable, and so you can either fight it or be a part of it, and you can find optimism and potential in those opportunities. So those are the kind of things that I think I'm learning about, and I'm latching on to as well.
So Jake, I'm curious. That was driven from the top down. Most people are going to enter the organization, and the top down might not have a big, huge vision and purpose. What can people bring in wherever they're at that kind of kicks into that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think for me, there's a couple things. It's learning who your players are in your organization. So what is taking place, but also it's recognizing that when you're new to an organization, there's a lot to learn. So it's putting that learner hat on, but also you're a new perspective. You're seeing things for the first time, or seeing things in a new light, or things like that. So for me, it's learning how and where to speak up, learning who you can ideate with, create with, seeking out what people's perspective is on creativity, and ways in which you can expand on process, whether you're coming in at a generalist perspective or an HR partner, or you're coming into the consulting space. Part of it is understanding the narrative that already exists in the organization, but also seeing where your org wants to go and ways in which you can ideate and create there. And I don't think everything has to happen at a senior global org level either. I think there's ways to do that even in your teams or in your smaller subsets of the organization, that can then end up having waves of impact in larger ways. My hope is, like, 20 years when you're started, like for me, I came in at the entry level. 20 years from when I started is that I am that top down, and I remember what it was like to be that frontline employee, and the value that I wanted to bring, and that I seek that out as a leader down the road, is that I look back to those folks that are in those roles coming in, because they are so powerful in shaping your organization, shaping the future of work.
Jake, I have a question going back to, as you were talking about Tesla, and that's, as you were talking about working for an organization that is where folks are focused on the hope and the optimism and a mission that's bigger than themselves. Working at the Gates Foundation, that's clearly something that we talk about all the time. And what I sometimes see is that can get in the way of resiliency or positive resiliency behaviors, because you're so focused on your life's work, the mission, saving lives, saving climate. And so what's your experience been? What was your experience there with how people prioritized resiliency, and how did that show up, or how did it not show up?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think there was a leader that our leader at the time, and still the leader today, was very much focused in on process. He's an engineer at trade, and so everything came back to, like, how can we make this better? And I think that there's a hard question, especially when you get stuck in hope, and the potential and optimism is actually also thinking about where you anchor that. So are you reflecting back on what's working or what's not, and how can you pivot those processes, or how you work together with other people in a way that still is moving the hope of the dream forward, but is also being realistic on, like, okay, here are the things that are preventing us from potentially bigger strides, because we're not taking time to reflect, we're not taking time to pivot. And so that's part of what I think I really took away in that environment at Tesla was like, you have to be real and upfront and honest with what is working, even if you're the one that's leading the charge. You don't want to call out all your faults or the things that aren't working, or I put this idea forth and it's not working. And to be able to say, it's not working, we're going to pivot this because we have something that we're working towards that's even bigger and better than this current moment in time. And that's hard for a lot of people because once we start in process of working towards something, that's when it's the differentiation between, are you seeing the forest or the tree? And sometimes you see the forest initially and then you go with a plan that's like, here's what we're doing, and then you get stuck at the tree and you can't see the forest anymore. And so it's being able to take that step back to say, what are we actually trying to do, and is what we're doing now still working us in that direction that moves us towards the forest, towards clean, for us it was climate, clean energy, clean air, those kind of things. And so being able to accept that pivots were automatically going to be a part of it was a huge thing. Change, if you didn't want change, Tesla probably wasn't the right organization for you because it was always changing. And so that was some of the things that I would say like weeded out folks from the long run of being there was around change. It's uncomfortable when you want routine or when you want things to be the same. And so that's something I think that also people need to consider when they're taking on jobs or careers or organizations, is that there's different levels of change, and they require, like, different orgs have different focuses on change, and that requires different levels of resilience. And really being true and honest with yourself of like, you can believe in something, but when are you getting in the way also as a human towards what that change could be? And when do you need to step aside? And so that can be tough and challenging, but it's something that you need to reflect on as an organization and as a human in the process of what you're trying to better serve going through.
Kira, I really appreciate you asking that question, because that like hope and optimism piece is me as well. And Jake, your response of like even just the strategy of identifying where your successes are, I think is huge for an organization that's trying to be resilient. And then just addressing and identifying, okay, we thought it was going to be success and it wasn't, so we're moving to the next thing that we think is going to work. And I think sometimes that is what you need to be resilient as an organization, is to identify those things and choose to move on, or choose to say, this is what we're doing really well, we're going to stick with it. That's great.
There's something also like when I think about, like, Paul, to your kind of thought of like new employees entering the workforce, also like new students entering into a grad program, that is your organization, that's your career for the next several years. And even looking back on my experience, what I thought I knew entering into, Paul Yost's OB 101, like first quarter, to what I know now was like, if I hadn't learned to pivot, if I hadn't been given that tough feedback that what worked for me in undergrad or what worked for me pre my program wasn't necessarily what was going to take me to be quote unquote successful moving through the program. And so for me, there was also something around like, how do I work with my cohort? How do I work with my peers? How do I pivot my style of studying? How do I think about things that are above and beyond what has worked for me in the past when they don't work? And those are those characteristics of learning in that process, I think also have shifted and shaped how I approached entering into the workforce. Asking questions of like, what's not working, or how can I continue learning, or how am I getting in my own way of what success looks like? And the reality is, like, businesses don't hand you, like, they don't hold your hand like a program does or school does. And so how do you learn in a safe space like we did in our SPU-IO program, but also kind of getting pushed out of the nest to be like, we will hold your hand, and at the same time you need to learn how to fly. And so that's kind of something that I would say, like, focusing in on, no matter what system or environment you're a part of, is looking at the ways in which you can learn to adapt and change and change your attitude, behavior, mindsets that support you, not just in that current moment, but what you're learning that you take forth and forward into other experiences, careers, relationships, etc.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Jake. And a lot of our viewers, I think, will get a lot of value out of everything you just said. Emily, do you want to share your story?
Yeah, I feel like Jake just gave me like the perfect segue into what I wanted to talk about in terms of pivoting and adapting to change. So I'm going to tell a story about a time in my past life that feels like a long time ago, but also not. And I wouldn't call it as a positive or a negative event. It was just an event. It was an event that a lot of you listening are going to go through or have recently gone through. I'm going to talk about my first job inside a company outside of grad school. So prior to Amazon, I was at a Fortune 150 company that was a telecom company, but also transitioning to tech. So a lot of change for them just in terms of the way that they made money. But when I entered this organization, I was also one of the very first members of their HR analytics team. So no one had my job before, which has then actually become a theme in my career so far, having jobs that I'm not backfilling anyone. I'm new to that space. And so it's really exciting, but also can be kind of scary at times. What made this a really unique experience, I think, was that that was my first job, like I mentioned, and I had done some consulting throughout grad school, but that's a little bit different, I think, than working internally in an organization. So it was my first job in a new role. I also had moved 2,000 miles away to a small town that I had never been to before. I didn't know, or actually I knew one person. It was the realtor that showed me around the town to help me find an apartment. So totally new sort of culture and dynamic, totally new place, didn't know anyone, new job, knew everything. So looking back at that decision, I probably didn't realize everything that I was getting into at one time, but I did it. I survived, and you can too. During that time, I would say like the strategies that I used were really relying on other people. So kind of like Jake was saying, every time you enter like a new phase of your life, you have to pivot. Like the goalposts have changed essentially. And when I came to SPU, it was figuring out how to be successful in grad school. And then starting my first job was figuring out how to be successful in that organization. And, you know, from here on out, for the rest of, you know, my career, I'll be adapting to new situations on new teams and new organizations. So that was just another case of kind of readjusting the goalposts, and you really have to think about what you're able to do and what makes you successful in one circumstance and how that applies to another. And so I was very nervous because like I said, I was the first person in this job, so not a lot of people understood HR analytics. Only a few people definitely knew what IO psychologists did and had heard of that. And so I remembered at one point that I had learned there are different types of people you can have in your network that give you different types of support. I want to say it was a Paul's motivation class. But I got to a point where I wasn't sure if I was being successful, and honestly, I probably wasn't, because the goalposts had changed. People were using words I didn't understand. Things had just kind of happened differently. And so I realized that there are a couple different people I needed to have. I needed to find a mentor, someone that showed up how I wanted to show up, and I could learn things from them. Someone who would kind of coach me through, tell me what I'm doing right and wrong and everything in between. Somebody to give me feedback on how I show up, like honest, candid feedback. And then some other people to lean on for social support, just to vent to, or, you know, just an actual friend. Like you need to have friends on your job. There's research that backs that up too. Look at one of Gallup's 12 questions. You know, do you have a best friend at work? That was one of their really predictive items. But so anyway, I reached out to people for support and kind of built my network. I found that helped a lot. Also, in terms of being successful at my job, I realized pretty quickly that I was going to have to do work through other people. Like, since people didn't know what HR analytics was, and we had some really big visible goals, I needed to talk to people to kind of learn like what their questions were. Like, what are their unanswered questions? And being a new person in a new role, you can really pick at that and dive into, like, so what questions do you have right now that you never even thought you could answer? And how could I solve that for you? So finding out what the need is and then learning how to communicate that in a way that people understand, I think is really helpful. And while you're doing that, you have to let go of a lot of things that you hold sacred. Like if there's a certain way that you like to say something, like some statistical terms and other jargon, but that doesn't land, like you have to let that go. So as much as it's learning new things and to figure out where the goalposts are, you also have to learn to let go of certain things and maybe reframe and be open to a new way of doing things. So yeah, I think that's my story.
I'm definitely curious. I think feedback is like another strategy that has come up a few times throughout these conversations. And how did you get yourself to know that you needed to go have that conversation with someone to say, I really just need someone to give me feedback, and how do I ask for that? And
well, when I couldn't tell myself if I was being successful, like I was brutally honest with myself and asked, like, how do I know if I'm doing a good job? And if I couldn't answer that question, or if I could answer the question but didn't know, then that's when I know that I need to ask for feedback. But now I'm a lot more self-aware of like when to ask for feedback, and whether or not you're self-aware, the answer is usually often. Like if you're wondering how things are going, just ask. Yeah, my manager now is really good at reminding me to ask, not because I need to, but just like she's constantly asking for feedback too. And when you're around other people that are constantly asking, then I feel like that becomes a part of, you know, what you're aware of. And I think just giving yourself permission to kind of stumble through that conversation and just strike it up with someone and be like, hey, I just want to know how things are going. Like, you know, what's been helpful, what's not. I'm not really sure how to bring this up, but I think it's really important that I do. Like, give yourself permission to stumble through it a little bit, and usually you get to a good place.
What is something that you received feedback on that you would say like has helped shape how you show up now or today?
That's a good question. Someone in my first job told me that I was very intimidating. And you don't always have to agree with feedback that people give you, by the way. But what I hadn't considered, I was shocked. I still am sort of shocked, but what I hadn't considered was the context. Our leaders were really excited about HR analytics, and we had a lot of smart people on our team. And so, you know, I show up a freshly minted PhD with all of my ideas and excitement, and my voice was showing up louder than I realized it was in conversations. And so when someone told me that, I was like, oh, I too need to be thoughtful about how I'm showing up and, you know, make sure I'm lifting up other people. It was almost acknowledging a power that I didn't even realize that I had. So yeah, that was some interesting feedback.
I was on mute. Emily, I loved how you talked about your awareness of not knowing what the goalposts were, and were you meeting the success profiles of the role. But I'm curious as to how you went about identifying who those folks would be to create that clarity. I think a lot of times we just go to our manager or go, you know, a lot of folks are like, well, I need to get the highest person in the organization that I can, because that will help push my career along to have that connection. So interested in how you identified pretty quickly and early on who those folks would be, who would tell you that truth, and speak into what you needed to hear to then be successful and drive through some of the difficulty.
Yeah. Well, I think like for like the type of like person, I guess, no, how do I want to phrase that? Some of them are easy, like you said, like you often go to your manager. Like there were some things I saw my manager do really well that I also wanted to do. So that was easy because I was like, oh, I want to learn that from this person. Like watching other people be successful in certain contexts helped me identify like who I would want to like give me that same feedback, if that makes sense. But also I think it's important to have a mix of people. Think of the people you go to meetings with that don't, maybe they're not the most vocal person at the table, but they're sitting and they're listening, they're observing. I think those are great people to talk to and maybe get overlooked sometimes.
Emily, who don't you go to? Who's the person who you shouldn't?
Who shouldn't? It's a red flag if you realize that you're only getting positive feedback from someone. Because I don't know if that's not that's not terrible, right? Everyone likes to hear nice things, but you're not really learning if you're only ever hearing the good things that you're doing. And everybody has something to learn. And also, I think people are at different phases in their own journey. And so, yeah, I think if you get feedback from someone, because I've tried to ask people for feedback or have relationships with people that I then decided like, maybe that wasn't a good fit. Like I think you're, like I said earlier, you're allowed to disagree with feedback that people give you, even your manager. You don't have to just, listen and just absorb everything. But sometimes I've gotten feedback that didn't sit well with me. And when I thought about why and realized that there could be a certain reason for the feedback or like, something else going on that I don't want to be a part of, then that's a good indication of like, okay, maybe I won't tap on this person for XYZ. Because not all feedback is created equal, and everyone's on their own path. So.
By the way, I love that answer, and I really appreciate everything about you.
Oh, bye.
So don't go to Paul for as one of your feedback people. No, I'm just
really quick question I have for you is this was an experience you had kind of early on, right out of completing school, and kind of you didn't really, like you said, the goalposts were changeable and you kind of found your way early on, but along the way. Has that shaped how you're in a different role now? So like, how has that shaped how you give feedback to like make sure that the people who are in your shoes now kind of stay resilient through that event?
Yeah, I tell people what not to do based on things I've done that didn't work. But I generally try to give feedback the way that I would like to receive it, and it's really easy to digest feedback that you feel like is coming from like someone who truly wants to help you and is like, hey, I learned this thing, this worked for me, what if you tried that, and like a kind of like an appreciative inquiry, like learning type of space, instead of like do this, not that, just to kind of help people figure it out, because we're all figuring it out.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, I love that. And that's, I think, a good note to end on. We're all trying to figure it out. So thank you. Thank you, Jake and Emily, for sharing your stories. And we'll just end with, if either of you could share like your go-to article or book or TED Talk, or any piece of, next steps that someone watching this could go do after.
Yeah, I can go. I've got two books that I would recommend. My first is Grit by Angela Duckworth, and it's how to persevere beyond talent. Like, you can be the most talented person in the game, but like, how do you use passion perseverance to continue driving you beyond what talent would suggest. And then the next one's Atomic Habits by James Clear. And it's about building good habits. So the small, minute things that you could do that start building positive and good habits. And at the same time, starting to unhinge some of the bad habits we might have that aren't productive for us. So both of those things. And if I had to go with a TED Talk, I'd go with Simon Sinek, start with the why, because there's something around understanding why and what drives you that will inform not only what you do, but how you do it. Which can be a huge narrative storytelling piece to drive hope and optimism beyond just what you do.
Nice. That's the researcher, the Paul side of you. You said 2 and gave 3. Emily, do you have yours?
Yeah, I have one book and then one go-do. And so I'll start with the go-do. I recommend to everyone that's listening, if there's someone, or think of someone you've been working closely with over the past few weeks, or, maybe it's a roommate or someone you've been spending a lot of time with since you've been in quarantine, but just ask them for feedback, ask how things are going and, how you can help each other out. I think just asking the question is a really positive sentiment, and you might get some good learnings along the way. So that's my go-do. And then the book is actually, Paul's gonna laugh because we've been talking about this book for years, but it's called Anti-Fragile, and it's by Nassim Nicholas Taleb. He's written some other interesting books, like Fooled by Randomness and Black Swan. I think he has a background in economics. But anyway, really good book. It just really has seemed to taken on new meaning with this pandemic. It's so anti-fragile. It's about this concept of anti-fragility where things like whether it's buildings, businesses, relationships, like there are certain qualities that make things stronger with wear and tear instead of weaker. So anti-fragile would be the opposite of fragile. And so what I think is so fascinating about that book right now is just looking at all of the companies and people and different things that have actually been strengthened by this pandemic instead of weakened. And so it's just interesting to think about like what type of mechanisms you could build into your own life or your own business or whatever you're doing to get stronger with time and circumstance. So just a fun idea I've been playing around with. It seems to keep coming up in life. So it's a good read. It is not a light read. So carve out some time for it, but it's worth it.
Well, everyone's got some time right now, so that might be really good. So I think that's all we've got for you for our second part of our resilience talks. And thank you to everyone viewing. And oh my gosh, thank you to all of our wonderful panelists who are doing this with us and having this conversation about resilience with us. It's been fantastic. And if anyone has any questions, please just email us. Cody and I can answer any questions you might have.